Hello everyone, greetings from the 7th of Nero, AJ here, continuing the saga of Immoren, now that the Orgoth have been defeated. There is enough that occurred throughout this time between said defeat of the Orgoth and the start of the Warmachine Hordes storyline, that this has been split into two. The eponymous Iron Kingdom's era serves most as a narrative foundation for said storyline, and does so over the course of only a few hundred years, compared to the coverage of the previous installments, that each address stretches of Immoren's history on the scale of 1,000 years, or thousands of years even. Naturally, because of the temporal proximity, it makes sense to have a more detailed history from around this time, but in many respects it makes sense in world too, owing to the destruction caused during the Orgoth occupation. Civilization, particularly human civilization, needed to pick up the pieces in the aftermath, which provides a lot of justification within the setting to preserve a record of how they did along the way. When the Iron Alliance signed the treaties that redrew the borders of Western Immoren's nations, it did not take long for old enmities to become apparent. Ord emerged from the union of Tordor and Northern Thuria. Lael brought an acquiescent Eastern Umbri under Rhinish leadership, while Khador replaced much of the old provinces of the Khardic Empire, and Caspian-led Cygnar laid claim to the city-states and former confederations of the south, including the Thornwood and Southern Thuria. But Khadoran imperial ambitions led them to quickly treat their former allies with distrust. Much of the territory that Khador's rulers believed was rightfully theirs had been ceded to the other nations of the Iron Kingdoms. Among other things, this distrust led to the formation of the Grey Lord Covenant. Amongst others, Khadoran members of the Fraternal Order of Wizardry were swayed by the patriotic words of their king, Lavesh Tsepeshi, as well as the subterfuge of the budding Khadoran intelligence service. The same patriotism would lead to the prompt rearmament of the Khadoran forces, including their own force of colossals that could contend with those fielded by their southern rivals. For while the foundries of Khador were destroyed by the Orgoth, the Khadorans inherited the knowledge of colossal technology from their Khard predecessors, supplemented by the lore brought north by the founding members of the Grey Lord Covenant. Parallel to these developments, the Fraternal Order was further divided as a result of its growing reach across Western Immoren. Though based largely in Cygnar, the Order had chapters in almost every province with significant populations, with all the problems that such a wide reach entailed. Copernicum, a devout Morrowan, came to be disgusted by the corruption he believed was rife throughout the Order, and defected amongst much acrimony along with many like-minded followers who, together, formed the Morrowan Order of Illumination. This came amidst the Fraternal Order's efforts to regain stability now that its membership had splintered off to form two rival organizations. Many would be tried for lesser infractions, such as fraud, but some were executed for infernalism. Unfortunately for the Cygnarans, ruled at this time by Woldred the Wise, they also had other more immediate problems. Trollkin Creoles of the Thornwood and the Gnarls, while given concessions as part of the terms of the Corvus treaties, were increasingly encroached upon or outright displaced by their human neighbours as part of the nation's efforts to repair the damage dealt by the Orgoth. In a series of clashes, the Trollkin attempted to secure the return of the lands that they had settled, leading to the Trollkin Wars. The first of these conflicts lasted 5 years with comparatively sporadic fighting across much of northern and eastern Cygnar, until, fed up with the continual back and forth, the humans sent forth their colossals, and where they set foot, the Trollkin fell or fled. The Creoles, only united nominally in their animosity towards those who reneged on the original treaties, were compelled to surrender in 247 AR. But over the next 15 years, during which the Cygnarans had to contend with open Khadoran aggression, the Creoles recovered their strength and eventually started to conduct incursions into Ord as well as the human-populated areas of Cygnar, in response to seeing their lands overrun once more by the armies of mankind as North fought South. With lessons learned from the First War, the Trollkin employed new tactics and strategies, seeing much greater success in their efforts, even against the Colossals, which were quickly showing their age and inefficiency in operating costs and logistics. Moreover, they were few, and the warriors of the Creoles learned to skirmish to great effect against them, succeeding in bringing several down during the course of the war. Embarrassed by such reverses, Cygnaran military engineers, supported by mechanics and arcanists from the Fraternal Order, adapted Steamjack and Cortex design for military purposes, giving rise to what is now a ubiquitous part of civilized warfare, the Warjack. These new weapons came as a shock to the Trollkin, able to skirmish far better than their forebears in the heavily forested regions where most of the fighting took place. After another 5 or so years of this second Trollkin War, the two sides, seeing nothing to be gained by further conflict, agreed a peace in which, despite the Cygnarans regaining strategic parity, saw the Cholkin granted dedicated lands to settle that would be considered sacrosanct by the humans, as well as revenue from waterway taxes. And in return, the Trollbloods would be subject to Cygnaran law when away from their Creel territories. Cygnaran-Cholkin relations would, by and large, steadily improve from this point onwards, though machinations of the Druids of the Circle Law Boros proved to be a complication in future generations. Punctuating this period of on and off fighting between human and Trollkin was the rising tensions between Khador and Cygnar. The Khadorans had built up an impressive army of their own colossals, which, by the end of the First Trollkin War, had been discovered by Cygnaran spies. Because of this, those forces, including colossals, that fought in the Thornwood remained there to serve as a deterrent against the Khadorans. It would not prevent war though, as in 250 AR King Lavesh mounted an ambitious assault on all three of his human neighbours, seeking to regain every acre of formerly Khardic territory. Being of much more recent design and manufacture, the Khadoran colossals held the upper hand in battle, but the allies weathered the northern storm and Khadoran long-term strategy ultimately failed, stretched too thin and unable to maintain the levels of production necessary to replace inevitable losses. And when the allied nations of Laos, Cygnar and Ord launched a counter-invasion that culminated in a crushing victory at Volningrad, the Khadorans were compelled to surrender after 7 years of brutal fighting. Resentful at his defeat and the enforced dismantling of his colossals and foundries, Lavesh sought to rebuild, but was still too weak to contend with Cygnar even in the aftermath of the Second Cholkin War. He would die in 272 AR and be succeeded by Dmitry Topatovic, who, with his Cygnaran counterpart, ushered in a rare period of Khadoran-Cygnaran friendship. Few now would accept that any pair of Khadoran and Cygnaran monarchs could be friends for as long as they ruled. This friendship, combined with the accelerating production of warjacks, led Woldred to decommission Western Immoren's last colossals in 286 AR. Amity between the two great powers lasted only 14 years though, ending when Dmitry was assassinated, followed 3 years later by the sudden death of Woldred. It is alleged that Dmitry's wife, Cherize, orchestrated her husband's murder, and circumstantial evidence supports this. She immediately established herself as a queen to be feared, and her reputation as a sorceress, with many believing her a Thamarite, drew apprehension from both the Ardorian kingdoms and her own subjects. Meanwhile, the Cygnaran throne went to the old king's nephew, Malagant. His oppressive reign, marked by open contempt, bordering on blatant persecution of the Mennonite faith, would lay the foundation for the religious schism in Cygnar that would happen less than 200 years after his death. Fortunately for him, Cherize was the aggressor in renewed hostilities between the two kingdoms, and while both rulers were tyrants of the worst sort, Khadoran employment of Tharn tribes against the Cygnarans and the ensuing barbarity led many moral and knightly orders to side with the lesser evil. The Border Wars, as this new conflict is referred to thanks to occurring mostly along the Khador-Cygnar border, along the northern reaches of the Thornwood, marked a nadir in the fortunes of both nations, whether their peoples or diplomacy between them. Regrettably, the Border Wars long outlasted both of these despised monarchs. Both died in quick succession in 295 AR, throwing their respective nations' ruling establishments into disarray. Khador's new child queen, installed by backroom political wrangling, was treated as a puppet by her ambitious regent, Velibor, while Malagant never declared a successor and died childless, leaving the southern kingdom without a king and in turmoil until Malfast took the throne. Initially paralysed by a lack of leadership, Cygnar could only look on while Velibor oversaw a successful campaign of expansion into both Ord and Lael. However, his fortunes changed when the Tharn that fought for him laid siege to Midfast. Continuing the policy of the late Queen, Velibor treated with Tharn chieftains and persuaded them that much glory was to be sought in the south. They pillaged their way into Ordic lands with a Khadoran invasion army in close attendance, but were halted before the walls of Midfast, which would witness a defining act of Ordic bravery. After an arduous siege, Marcus Graza, the garrison's commander after the deaths of several of his superiors and the remaining defenders close to capitulation, challenged every chieftain to single combat to embolden his soldiers and stall for time, allowing reinforcements to draw near. For 7 days he fought and bested one chieftain after another, sustaining severe injuries that grew worse from the 5th day onwards, until, upon defeating the 14th chieftain, he stood victorious through sheer force of will alone. According to eyewitnesses, the ascendant Katrina appeared amidst the bright light to welcome Marcus in ascension, just as he collapsed and died from his wounds. It is said that many Tharn transformed from their beastly forms and converted to the Moran faith there and then, while others, confused by what had happened, withdrew in disorder, while the remainder were defeated by the arriving relief forces. The Khadorans were equally shocked and could do little but retreat when they saw the collapse of the Tharn hosts. On the back of reverses here and in the Cygnaran mainland, Khador failed to make any further gains for the remainder of the border wars, thanks in part to Malfast's aggressive strategy, though he passed away shortly before the end of the war. Like the deaths of those who started the war, Ein Venor V of Khador and Juliana of Cygnar came to rule in their own right in quick succession. Within a few years, when Ein gathered enough influence to discover the extent of Velibor's mishandling of the Khadoran economy and have him deposed, the rival queens swiftly agreed a peace that restored the old borders of all nations, though Ein succeeded in annexing Radovo to Khador, which was renamed Vladivar, the future home of the Khadoran navy. The ensuing peace led to what is known as the Quiet Century, where direct conflict between the two great powers was replaced by intermittent proxy wars, while the nations themselves were able to experience a second renaissance of sorts, the first one having been cut short by the Orgoth invasion. Developments, whether civil, military, cultural, or religious, became common during this time. Many technologies that are in use to this day find their origin in the Quiet Century, such as warcaster armor. Meanwhile, other technologies, most notably railway communications, proliferated extensively across Western Immoren in a comparatively short amount of time, linking its urban centres. Religious scholarship thrived, as did arcane, with the establishment of many universities dedicated to studying the arcane and mechanical. Amidst all this, the 283 AR discovery of a new celestial body dubbed the Dark Wanderer by Agamor of the Fraternal Order eventually gave rise to the cult of Cyrus, so named because of visions dreamt by some of its founding members. The Quiet Century allowed this fringe faith to further its work in attempting to solve the complex equations that seemed to form from the movement of other celestial bodies around the so-called Maiden of Gears. It would only recently come to light that they also actively sought to attain transcendence from the flesh of their biological forms through transference to mechanical bodies. Such did they believe in the primacy of mathematics and engineering over other forms of knowledge. Cyricists were not the only ones who sought knowledge about their goddess, though. After the return of Syra and the much-delayed admission by her Fane's priest that her strength was but a shadow of what it once was, theologists and scholars sought answers to explain our goddess's weakness. Emissaries and agents of Ios already lived among mankind, though their work was rendered perilous until the Orgoth were destroyed. But even so, they reported what they saw of humanity's developments, including the sudden appearance and spread of arcane skill and lore. Over a Hessian also, early on in the Iron Kingdom's era, the theory that the gods of humanity were the cause of the Divine Court's loss took hold in some parts of Ios society, and that human use of arcane power actively weakened Syra. Countering them were those who denied this theory, ascribing it to nothing more than coincidence. As the two sides of this argument learned more about the origins of the arcane in humanity, the fledgling groups that coalesced around them would take root in Ios, giving rise to the retribution of Syra and the Seekers. Both sought the same goals, if in very different ways, for the retribution used what they saw in the present, while the Seekers looked to millennia-old prophecies and texts. Despite their radical differences, though, both were outlawed almost upon foundation, for being subversive towards what the consulate court perceived as the stability of the nation. Nevertheless, both groups persisted, for what they believed was for the future of elven kind. Humanity would be blissfully unaware of the existence of both of these organizations, for the Seekers would prove to be as much an enigma as the Retribution, despite their different approaches. Perhaps as a result, for better or worse, the Iron Kingdoms progressed heedless of the growing hatred Iosans would hold for humans gifted with arcane magic, if for no other reason than that the Quiet Century would eventually come to an end, and mankind would have upheavals aplenty once more.